Hey everybody, and welcome to the Risen Empire Book Club. In this series, we're going to be exploring the strange new worlds and unexpected journeys of science fiction and fantasy. I'm your host, David, joined by my co-host,
Ethan.
and we want to welcome you to the very first in a long series of planned reviews and discussions here on the Risen Empire, as we explore some of our favorite novels. Please take a minute to like, share, and subscribe below. Every interaction really does help this channel grow, and we're having a lot of fun bringing you all this content. Remember to turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Now for our first journey today, we're going to be diving into The Martian by Andy Weir. After a brief synopsis, we're going to talk about some of our favorite parts and the unique way in which the book was written. Now, this should be obvious, but spoilers are ahead, so be aware of that.
You've been warned.
Set in the near future of 2035, The Martian emerged as a serialized gem on Andy Weir's personal blog in 2011, later rocketing into the spotlight with the 2015 film starring Matt Damon. Today, we'll mostly be talking about the trade paperback and the audiobook versions, and we'll dissect some of the differences between them and talk about the differences between the books and the movie. Now, without further ado, let's warp into the world of The Martian by Andy Weir. The book begins, I'm pretty much fucked. That's my considered opinion. Fucked.
This first line perfectly describes the situation in which astronaut Mark Watney finds himself. At the beginning of Andy Weir's The Martian, Mark Watney is left for dead by his crew on Mars, facing threats from starvation and dehydration to asphyxiation and intense loneliness. We follow Mark as he uses his ingenuity and unbreakable spirit to traverse thousands of miles to escape the inhospitable red planet millions of miles from home.
The story kicks off with Mark and his team only 6 days into a month-long stay on Mars when disaster strikes. A powerful storm jeopardizes their return ship, leading them to abandon their mission and head back for safety. On their way to escape, Mark is struck by debris, launched into the storm, and lost to his crew. Mission Commander Melissa Lewis makes an agonizing call, prioritizing her crew's safety and ordering them to the MAV, the Mars Ascent Vehicle. Mark's vitals flatline, and it's assumed that he's gone.
Major Rick Martinez, the mission pilot, successfully escapes Mars with the crew, leaving behind their presumed dead colleague. In shock, they dock with the Hermes for the 6-month journey home. Through a series of rather fortunate accidents, Mark survives and returns to the HAB just in time before running out of oxygen. With his communication system destroyed during the storm, he realizes that he is completely alone.
Mark, refusing self-pity, immediately begins to work on a plan. Aware that the next Ares mission will be arriving in 4 years, he knows he might have a chance to escape, but he doesn't have enough food to survive. So he draws on his botanical experience, which was a key reason for his selection for the program in the first place. And Mark transforms his living area into a potato farm on Mars.
Now, the narrative occasionally shifts to NASA and the Hermes, following Mark's crew. The news of his death has reached the public, and ceremonies are planned in his honor. NASA Director Teddy Sanders and Ares Mission Commander Mitch Henderson discuss options to recoup losses by extending the Ares mission to return to the site of Ares 3.
After ordering satellite footage, Mindy Park notices movement in the rovers, suggesting that Mark may still be alive. After a panicked midnight call to Ares Director Mitch Henderson, the two confirm Mark's presence on the planet and realize that he has been marooned. Despite strong objections from several members of his staff when confronted with the news, NASA Director Teddy Sanders decides not to inform the Ares crew still en route from Mars about Mark's survival. He believes that knowing that they've left someone behind will distract and endanger them. So Teddy does mobilize a mission to send emergency supplies and, importantly, a radio to Watney.
Now, on Mars, Mark is growing his potatoes, and he's formulating a long-term survival plan, resorting to extreme measures like burning rocket fuel to create water. We follow his modifications to the rovers for a long-range trip. As NASA observes Mark's preparations through satellite footage, they witness him driving away into the Martian desert. Mark recovers an abandoned Mars rover to retrieve its radio. Now, in communication, Mark's luck seems to be changing. NASA and Mark formulate a plan to keep him alive until the next Ares mission.
Working closely with NASA, Mark modifies the rovers for the 2,000-plus mile trip to rendezvous with Ares 4. However, a catastrophic airlock failure kills all of his plants, leaving him without enough food to survive. NASA faces the challenge of reaching Mark before he starves, but a rushed resupply launch ends in disaster. The Chinese Space Agency offer their rocket, the Taiyang Shen, as a final chance to get supplies to Mark. But an orbital dynamicist named Rich Purnell suggests an alternative, having the Hermes crew return to Mars to rescue him. Teddy rejects the plan immediately as being far too risky, but Mitch secretly shares the plan with the crew, leading to a unanimous decision to mutiny and save Mark.
Now, with at least a hope to escape, Mark faces a tight deadline. Unable to slow down the Hermes, he must travel to the Ares 4 landing site and use the MAV left by the crew. As he begins the process, he accidentally shorts out his communication system, leaving him alone with no support. Mark, without NASA's assistance, faces even more challenges during his journey, including avoiding a sandstorm and dealing with a rover accident. Finally, he reaches the MAV, and NASA walks him through preparations and modifications for a high-speed launch to meet the Hermes.
So during the launch, several more issues arise naturally, forcing the Hermes crew to take drastic measures to pick up Mark in orbit. Back on board, Mark is reunited with his crew after being alone for 549 Martian days. Finally safe and finally on the way home. The book ends with the line, "This is the happiest day of my life." So there we have the synopsis of The Martian, which you may have noticed does vary a little bit from some versions you may have read or listened to. This is in large part due to the unique way Andy Weir wrote the novel. It was originally published in serial form to his own website in 2011, and Andy made nearly constant revisions for the next 3 years. His community aided in the math and science behind the book, fact-checking and advising him all the way through the process. Eventually, he released it as a single ebook on his website, and then on Kindle as an official download, which went viral. Each version saw revisions and modifications, including toning down the language as he went. And in 2014, Crown Publishing acquired the rights and released the official version of the story. Many revisions were made before this, including the removal of a short epilogue that sees Mark back at home. And I wanted to talk about this because I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
In that version, Mark's an advisor for Ares 6, which was the mission that NASA had been considering when they realized Mark was alive in the first place. And in this epilogue, we see a child approach Mark and ask him about his time on Mars, and even asks him, "Would you ever go back?" To which Mark replies, "Are you fucking kidding me?" And I wish that they had left that in.
They really should have. It would be a fitting send-off. But I like how it ended, at least the versions I've heard, which is the only book version I've read has been the audiobook.
Yep.
I have not read this version, which we have the classroom edition here today in front of us.
We do.
But I'm not even sure what the differences are.
So yeah, you've only listened to the audiobook, which ends a little bit differently.
Yep.
And there are 2 versions of the audiobook. The first was released in 2014 along with the original paperback novel.
Yeah.
That one has the same ending as the original novel.
Okay.
This is the happiest day of my life. But in 2020, it was re-released and narrated by Will Wheaton, of Star Trek fame, of course, and featured an additional section at the end that you've listened to.
Yes.
And that is actually a long ago part of the story that Andy Weir had cut out.
Okay.
That was originally going to be more at the beginning of the book. His original plan was that Mark was going to be the only POV character through the entire story. Okay. No NASA, no Hermes.
Pure first person.
Truly pure first person.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of that version, it started off with basically his journal.
Yeah.
Detailing his experiences before the selection to the Ares program, during the process of going through Ares, and just before his launch to Mars.
Right.
So Andy dug that portion out for the 2020 re-release, modified it a little bit, fitted in better with the canon of the actual story.
Yeah.
And then that was re-narrated by Will Wheaton, which is a wonderful audiobook, and I thoroughly enjoy the heck out of it.
It is. He does a fantastic job narrating.
He really does. He's my favorite audiobook narrator by far. In 2016, the Classroom edition was published, which I have right here. This is a beautiful rendition of this book. It's got a map of the region that Mark is exploring in here. A lot of information, a lot of details on the science behind the mission and his work and the things that he did with it. And it's been modified, the language has, to fit better in a classroom setting than I'm fucked, which, isn't so appropriate. I actually got this for my daughter, who's 7.
Yes.
And I don't want her reading a book that leads off with that particular phrase.
Very first line. Yeah.
Right. So this one actually starts with, I'm screwed.
Softens it up a little bit.
It does. It does. And it's a beautiful version. I recommend anybody pick it up if you've got kids or anybody like that in your family or in your life. So talking about how the story came to be, the origin behind Andy's building of this story and how he put it together and why he put it together and how his mind works. He's published a few other novels. The Martian was actually his 3rd novel that he wrote. And he just has a unique mind for science.
Very much so.
He was raised by a computer engineer and a particle physicist.
That kind of explains some things.
Yep.
Yeah.
It'll give you a lot. Or I'm sorry, he was raised by a particle physicist and an electrical engineer.
Oh, okay.
My mistake.
Also fits. Makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Just before he started diving into writing this, he actually had worked at AOL. He was laid off when they were acquired and he was forced to sell his stocks.
Oh, okay.
But it happened to be right when their stocks were basically at the highest they ever were. Turned out to be a blessing in disguise, so he took a few years off and was able to write his first few novels. He started acquiring a following online, and then in his own blog, he started publishing The Martian, basically like one chapter at a time.
Okay.
In a serialized form, working with his community to tweak and edit the story.
Okay.
And he often put at the beginning of the whole thing that it was a work in progress. He reserved the right to change anything he wanted. Nothing mattered until it was finalized. So he did an excellent job, of course, of digging into the science behind it.
Yeah.
Not perfect by any means, It has some issues, and we'll talk about those.
You got to make it work for a book, though. I mean, sometimes you got to push reality just a little bit. Suspension of disbelief.
You do. You have to.
Yeah.
At some point, you just have to make it work.
Yeah.
The Deus Ex Machina,
Exactly.
so to speak. He also digs into the psychology really well in this book, and that's something that I find really fascinating that isn't talked about too much.
Right.
People talk often about how brilliant his science is, how brilliant his reasoning is, how well he digs into the story and the way that it fits together, and one thing leads naturally to another. It's never just and then this, and then this.
Right.
It all fits really well. But he also digs into human psychology in a way that I think very few authors can.
Well, he had an interesting kind of opportunity to be able to put a character in an extreme isolation climate, which, as many scientific studies have been done, have very profound effects on the human psyche.
It sure does. I mean, we all went through COVID.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
remember Mark handled a year and a half better than any of us handled 3 months.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. A NASA engineer, talking about that psychology point of things, actually was once quoted as saying, I want to know his source at NASA because he knows things that are really hard to learn.
Yeah.
And his focus on that psychology was very core at the construction of the story.
Sure.
And in its genesis in the first place. He kind of treated this like a cross between a doctoral thesis and a classic 1950s science fiction serial.
Yeah.
Right? It's that adventure romp, but it's got real stakes. It's kind of a Robinson Crusoe meets The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of story. Michael Crichton is my personal favorite author.
He's a good one.
And I've looked for years for someone who writes with that same respect to hard science.
Yeah.
And Andy Weir is the only person I've ever found that does.
You really can't find it anywhere else. I mean, again, back to the bending of the laws of nature just a little bit, but he at least starts it all with hard science and tweaks it maybe here and there where he needs to. But he goes for it. He digs in. He clearly does the research or has people who are experts in these fields, which he just has a contact for everything, clearly, which it works out for him because anybody who's read this book knows it is full of scientific jargon.
Yep.
Full of it.
So are both of his follow-up novels as well, which we've also read and we'll be talking about in a future episode. Artemis, set in a city on the moon, and Hail Mary.
Project Hail Mary,
my mistake.
Yes.
About a man tasked with an impossible mission.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yep.
I like it.
I also find that in connection with that brilliant scientific reasoning of Michael Crichton, he avoids the dryness that Michael Crichton sometimes gets to his stories.
Very much so. Sometimes Michael Crichton can sound like a lecture.
Yep.
Yeah, just a little bit.
He's a little bit clinical.
Yeah.
Not his fault. Man he was a medical doctor. He was a doctor of
the man was
philosophy.
A genius, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
But Andy kind of adds that tweak, that style that you get from people like Mark Twain. That real sense of sarcasm and turn of phrase.
Yeah.
But he's also got Stephen King's ability to make truly real characters.
Yeah.
Which goes back to what you were saying about a character in true isolation. Mm-hmm. For a character to be engaging in isolation is crazy. Yeah. You know, the most difficult episodes of television are the ones where two people are locked in a room.
Yeah.
Or two people are locked in an elevator or anything like that. And you'll hear directors and writers and producers and actors talk about how incredibly difficult those episodes can be because you've got to bear it all on the back of one or two people. Mm-hmm. They have to carry all of the engagement for the audience.
Yeah.
It was actually a big problem casting the movie. And it was something that they were very concerned about because very few actors can be engaging enough to be the only thing on screen.
For like literally 95% of the movie.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's how the movie was cast the way that it was, and I think it was brilliant. And Matt Damon, of course, did a brilliant job.
I was just about to call him Mark Damon. So
I was too, yeah.
He is so much that character.
He is. I actually saw the movie long before I read the book.
I did as well. I watched the movie quite a few times, and then it was an interesting experience going back and reading the book, which we'll actually get into this in just a minute, but it's a fantastic movie adaptation.
It really is.
Yeah.
So hold on to that thought, and we'll get to that. He wrote this story in large part because he was frustrated with those normal, typical tropes in sci-fi movies where the astronauts just always are at odds with each other, fighting with one another. As a matter of fact, he cited Ridley Scott's Alien as a principal inspiration of frustration for why he wrote this book. And then his movie was directed by Ridley Scott.
Yeah.
And that's not meta enough. I don't know what is.
That's called irony.
It really is. I love that. So while he was writing the story, he had three really solid rules for his crew.
Sure.
The first was that it was based on the idea that astronauts are incredibly professional. I've had the fortune to meet, actually, 2 astronauts in my lifetime. And I will tell you, you will never meet a more expertly professional individual.
They can't afford to have a mental breakdown.
No, and it has almost never happened in the history of manned spaceflight.
Yeah.
They've been very careful with the selection. They've made mistakes before. It has happened, but very, very rarely.
Yeah.
And so he was very dedicated to that. So his story was focused around those 3 major rules. The first was that astronauts, his crew, had to be extremely good with technical skills. Nothing could catch them off guard. They had to be ready for every mistake that came up. Might take them a minute, they might struggle with it, but they're ready, they've got it.
Yeah.
They also have an incredible esprit de corps. They don't butt heads, they're very professional. They're always upbeat, always willing to take the next risk.
Yeah.
They also had to have a deep and profound confidence in their commander and complete faith in Commander Lewis. And that's another thing that you see echoed very solidly through this book and through the movie, that they don't question her.
Right.
When she says something, they roll with it. Mm-hmm. When they mutiny, she gives them the choice.
That's true.
You don't have to. Any of you can come to me. And there will be, it'll be anonymous, but we won't do it.
Right.
But they all agreed to because they respected her.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what that NASA engineer was talking about. I want to know what his sources are because he really does dig into that psychology in a way that unless you've met astronauts, it's hard to be able to do. I mean, I have met two personally. I don't think I could have crafted them that well.
No, I mean, clearly I'm sure he knows some astronauts. He has some buddies at NASA at least. He's got to know somebody.
I don't know. Before he started writing books, he was just a computer engineer who worked at AOL.
Who knows? Maybe he's just really good at research.
He is really good at research. Again, I mean, his parents were scientists.
Exactly.
He was probably raised with that scientific process in mind,
Absolutely,
like I raised my kids.
Right.
Now, the book, speaking to those scientific accuracies, does have some scientific inaccuracies, some of which he knew about while writing the story.
Right.
And were conscious decisions, like you mentioned earlier, to drive the story forward.
Sure.
Some were things he just didn't know.
Yeah.
But not all perfect. Even Andy Weir. One of the first was that all through the thing, right, Mark getting out of his base camp there in Schiaparelli Crater and getting to the MAV.
Right.
He has to bring the oxygenator with him, which is this giant machine that technically also doesn't really exist yet. He has to cram it into his rover because he can't just use CO2 filters.
Right.
Well, it turns out you can use CO2 scrubbers over again by just baking them in the sun.
Fascinating.
Could have just left them outside.
Simple.
Andy was frustrated by that one when he
I would imagine so, yeah. That's a really kind of large plot point.
It is.
For the entire story, not just the main journey, but I would imagine that kind of rippled his feathers a little bit when he learned that.
He was frustrated. Also, it turns out that creating water in the hab, the way that Mark did by burning rocket fuel at the pace that he did, would have heated up the air inside the hab enough to cook him alive. One of Andy's followers apparently went through and did the math on the square footage of the hab, the cubic volume of the hab, how much energy was being released, how much energy was being converted back into water, and figured out that he would have very quickly raised his temperature in his tent to well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh my. Yep. So crispy astronaut.
Crispy astronaut.
Yeah.
Also, the biggest one, and some of you may know this. If you don't, it's an interesting note here.
This one is rather huge.
It is so huge because it is the whole beginning of this story. So there is not actually enough air pressure on Mars to knock over a spaceship.
Nope, not even close.
The air pressure on Mars would struggle to knock over a cardboard box.
Yes. The density of the atmosphere is very, very low on Mars. Literally nothing would happen to the ascent vehicle.
Any kind of spaceship.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they're only really at risk on Earth from hurricanes and tornadoes.
Yeah.
So, well, that's more complicated than that.
It's true.
There is lightning on Mars, though.
Yes.
Something Andy learned after he had published the final version of the book. Very briefly after publishing it, actually.
That's how it goes.
He was really disappointed with that. And has said a few times that he wished he'd known that before because it would have been an even better way to kick things off.
It would have, yeah.
And or to knock Mark out.
True.
Strike him with lightning.
Very true.
Why not?
Very true.
There are also some things that have changed since this book was written.
Yeah.
That were very scientifically accurate and are no longer quite as restrictive or quite as accurate.
Some advancements have been made.
Some enormous advancements, partially in form of communication, right? Part of his issue was in connecting to the satellite network.
Sure.
There is now a proper satellite network orbiting Mars. Not a lot of them, but enough that they can finally carry data.
Yeah.
They're also working on dropping several communication grids and networked satellites into Lagrange points between the Earth and the Sun.
Oh, okay.
Lagrange points, to be brief, I know you're not here for this. A Lagrange point is a point where gravity between multiple bodies is stabilized.
Yes.
And that point doesn't move as it goes around. Actually, the James Webb Space Telescope is in one of our Lagrange points. It allows it to sit in a very, very stable location without being at risk of movement.
Makes sense.
It also means they don't need a lot of fuel to keep it up there, and it can stay up a lot longer.
Ah, smart.
Yep. So communication is much less an issue than it would have been.
Yep.
We also now have much better heavy lift capabilities than we ever did before.
Very much so.
Rapidly reusable heavy lift vehicles like Falcon Heavy, which has been tested and proven, and Starship, which has, as of the recording of this episode, blown up twice.
Yeah.
Wonderfully successful tests. That's beside the point.
Yes.
But even with the Falcon Heavy, it would not be a matter of we only have one rocket able to get to Mars.
Right, that's just not a problem that exists anymore.
Back in the day, and until very recently, and I guess NASA actually still does this, rockets were built for a mission. One mission at a time. That rocket was built start to finish, constructed, launched, obliterated.
Yep.
That was it. Now rockets are built to be reused. They're built more sturdily to be able to stay up longer.
Yes.
So we can have that ready reusability without issue. Another really big difference that was discussed at the end of the book, the NASA engineers realized that they have to pull so much weight off of the MAV to get Mark to ascent and get him going so fast because the Hermes is in a long slingshot instead of a stable orbit.
Yep.
That they say to Mark that he's going to be the fastest man alive. And this is directly in the movie, too. He basically says that structural engineers, aerospace engineers, when they want to describe things like velocity, they don't use words like fastest. No. They just wanted to make him feel comfortable with it. And they mentioned that he's going to be in the first manned vehicle controlled from a third party.
Yep.
That has actually been done now with the Dragon craft from SpaceX.
Yes, it has.
That has been controlled remotely from the ground and from the ISS, and has proven that we can do that safely in the event of an astronaut passing out, which is exactly what happens to Mark.
Yes, it is.
Originally for the story, Andy had some different ideas.
Yeah.
I had mentioned earlier that he had considered having Mark be basically the only character through the entire thing, which I think would have been boring and made for kind of a weird narrative.
It certainly could have, yeah. Especially not knowing what was happening at NASA at the time.
Yeah.
Because that kind of directs a lot of Mark's actions.
It does.
Based on what we're learning as the audience.
And it adds a lot of suspense.
It does. It really does.
It really does.
Yeah.
He had also thought about on the ride from Schiaparelli to the MAV.
Yeah.
Had considered having Mark's RTG fail, his radiothermal generator.
The thing keeping him warm, essentially.
Yeah. Had considered having that fail, and Mark having to leave it beside. But his commitment to science, and how dedicated he was to making sure that he got all of his details right, he just couldn't make it work. Mark just didn't have enough power, no matter how he did it. So he had to let Mark keep the RTG. He really tried to throw, like, every possible catastrophe at this man.
Yeah.
He actually said that while writing it, he often thought, okay, what could go wrong now? And that was kind of how he wrote it, which I love. I think that's awesome.
It's a series of unfortunate events on Mars.
Yep.
That's really what it is.
Which is kind of how he led to the character of Mark being a botanist in the first place. Originally, he was just an astronaut.
Yeah.
And then he realized that just an astronaut's not going to be able to do it. He needs to know just a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so he decided to have Mark be a botanist instead. Or in addition to, I would say. The other key difference is that famous scene where Mark is fertilizing all of his soil.
Yes.
With night soil from his friends and himself.
Yes.
Probably wouldn't have needed to do that.
No, it wouldn't actually be necessary.
Yeah, it turns out that now scientists are reasonably confident that Mars actually has more nitrates in their soil than Earth does.
Yeah.
More beneficial minerals and vitamins that plants need to survive.
Sure.
Just no beneficial bacteria, which Mark mentioned he had because he had samples of Earth's soil.
Yes.
And that's all he would have needed. He did not need to stink up his entire place.
I mean, it made for a good read. It made for an entertaining bit of the story.
It did. That's another thing that Andy couldn't have known beforehand.
Right.
It wasn't well known.
Right,
before
that was only discovered relatively recently, right?
Yeah, it was only discovered within the last few months.
Yeah.
And again, it's not a for sure 100% we've tested it kind of thing.
It's we think we could do it.
Yeah. They have rovers on Mars that are more capable now of analyzing the soil, so they're starting to find these things.
Yeah.
There were some differences between the book and the movie.
Yes.
Some weird ones that I don't really understand.
Some that seem kind of pointless.
If anything, I think kind of reduce the tension and the value of the story a little bit. Like in the book, he leaves on Sol 650 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or in the book, he leaves on 561. In the movie,
Right.
he leaves at 6 something. It's just a couple of months difference.
Right. It's like, I don't know why they felt the need to add that extra little bit of time.
I'm not sure. I've done a little bit of research into trying to find out why that is.
Yeah.
And I've seen like some posts on Reddit, so take that as you may, saying that it was because it came out 2 years later. They were adjusting all of the dates to fit with the current Holman transfer windows.
Ah, okay.
And the actual orbital dynamics.
Sure.
I am not an orbital dynamicist, and I did not do the math myself, so I don't know.
We'll just give them the benefit of the doubt and say, sure.
Yep, Ridley Scott. He's a hardworking guy.
Yeah. Yep.
Some other weird differences. I get it from a narrative standpoint.
Yeah.
Commander Lewis, if you've seen the movie, is the one who jumps out of the Hermes using her EVA pack to go and rescue Mark. But they have an EVA specialist on board.
Whose sole job is to be the one exiting the spacecraft.
So it seems an odd choice to have the mission commander, who really should not be putting themselves at that level of risk at any point until it's needed.
Right.
Her job is to let everyone else die if she needs to.
Unfortunately, yes.
So it should have been Commander Beck, or Specialist Beck, rather, who went and got Mark, but instead was Lewis. And I get it from a Hollywood standpoint. She's kind of the hero of the story. She's kind of the heroine, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
Also in the movie, Mark doesn't lose contact with NASA after he gets the rover.
Not a second time, no.
No, he he's able to maintain that contact.
Yeah.
And again, I get it from a narrative standpoint. Mm-hmm. It's understandable that you gotta have him talking to somebody.
There's a lot more stumbling blocks in the book than in the movie, but I mean, you can only fit so much into a 2-hour movie. If you just kept on having roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, eventually you're just there for 6 hours, and you might as well read the book anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I don't know.
Yep, that's like the first season of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, pretty much.
Is like that. It's like verbatim.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So another small difference that I get doesn't matter, and I'm just being pedantic, but it just annoys me, is that they changed the rovers.
Yeah.
In the book, they are very much described as having an airlock, and then into the vehicle. But in the movie,
it's just a door.
It's just a door. And, like, yeah, we could say, like, oh, it cycles the air inside or whatever.
There's like a little whoosh of, like, air cycled or whatever, but that's...
But there's no dust in there.
No.
The screens would be just so covered in red dust.
Right.
I'm just, again, being pedantic. It just bothers me.
We're just nerds. We like chatting about this type of stuff. But, yeah, there's no airlock. There definitely should have been, even a small one.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And it's become one of my favorite stories to go back to again and again. And it's such an engaging character that a single character, single point of view, can carry me through multiple readings.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've never listened to the audiobook narrated by R.C. Bray. I'm sure he does a great job.
I've not either. That would be an interesting one to read at some point, just to see the differences.
It would be. But the audiobook narrated by Will Wheaton is very near and dear to my heart. I've been a Trekkie my whole life, so I love that he is an audiobook narrator. Yeah. And he does a great job. He does. He becomes Mark Watney.
He really does, yeah.
The Martian also stands, I think, as one of the greatest adaptations of film, of books I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
It is unbelievable how well it is adapted. It's almost shot for shot in many places.
Yeah, pretty much just, again, for length. It essentially just cut out things that didn't need to be there, but then everything that's left is essentially pulled straight out of the book.
It's so good as an adaptation.
It is.
It is a textbook example of how to adapt a work to fit on the screen.
This is a masterclass on a movie adaptation.
It really is. We recently looked at a trailer for a movie that did not do such a great adaptation.
It was less than stellar as an adaptation.
That's one way to put it.
Yes.
We looked at the trailer for Aragon.
The 2006 movie.
Yep. God-awful, terrible movie. Don't go watch the movie. Watch our video. Don't watch the movie.
Read the book series.
I'll put it up in a card thing if I remember to.
Yeah.
But the series is amazing, and it's going to be another book that we'll be diving into in our exploration here of sci-fi and fantasy. Mm-hmm. We're also going to be talking about the Dark Tower series, if any of you have read that. That's going to be a process.
That's going to be a long one.
We'll get there.
That's going to be multi-part, a lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of figuring stuff out.
Yep. The next book we'll be working on, if anybody'd like to read along with us to get ready to join us next time, is John Scalzi's The Kaiju Preservation Society.
It's a fun romp of a book.
It sure is. If you've read it, it is marvelous. If you haven't, I encourage it. It's an easy read. It's fun. It's engaging. It's uplifting. It's not a depressing kind of book at all.
It's really not.
It was written for that very purpose, which is something we'll get into when we dissect that book in our next book club meeting here.
Yep.
The Kaiju Preservation Society, just to let you know a little bit about it, is about a food delivery guy during the pandemic. And the friend that he makes who changes his life and offers him new opportunities to explore worlds he could not believe. If you've heard the word kaiju, you know what to expect. If you have not, then you are wonderfully surprised.
Yes, very much so.
So, do you have any final thoughts on The Martian?
I will mention one thing, specifically in the movie. At the very end, we see Mark, I believe 3 or 4 years after the end of his mission, as a teacher. And I'm not Johnson Space Center, I want to say, something like some place where NASA trains.
Yep.
And I very much liked.
Continue.
I don't know. I very much liked his kind of speech. It's a monologue that they end the movie with, and I very much enjoyed it. He's like, you're talking to a bunch of potential astronauts. He's like, you're going to come into a situation where you don't know what to do, where outlook is bleak. It looks like everything has gone to shit. What do you do? And he says, just begin. Take a problem, solve it, move on to the next problem, solve that.
Yep.
Just start. And that kind of always stuck with me from that movie, because it applies to a lot more than just being an astronaut.
That's very true, yep.
Just begin. And it would be interesting to see where it takes you.
It would be. And that is a wonderful tie-in to Andy's principal points in making the story.
Yeah.
That astronauts can't get discouraged. They have to be engaged. Mm-hmm. They have to be ready for everything.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite part of the story, a favorite scene, a favorite bit?
The thing that sticks out for me most in my memory from the movie in particular is when he first sets up the rover for contact, and he finally gets contact with NASA. He sees that the rover pointed, and he's just like, yes! He's just so excited, so happy. I don't know why, but that part of the movie always just sticks out to me as the first kind of upbeat part of the movie where stuff just isn't going wrong all the time.
Yeah. That is a great moment. And again, I mean, that goes back to
It's not the most dramatic moment, but...
No, but that goes back to Matt Damon's performance.
Exactly.
That in that moment, you're right, he's not jumping up and down and screaming and yelling. It's just one big pump, and you can see how excited he is. And, I mean, he's a masterclass actor for a reason.
Oh, yeah.
There's a reason you get cast in a role like that, and it's not by accident.
Yeah.
I have studied aerospace engineering. I have studied the physics of rocketry. I've built model rockets. I have loved these bits of science my entire life. I've studied astronomy and a bit of orbital dynamics. And having a story that puts all of those things together so well.
Yeah.
Is just wonderful. Another story that we'll be going through at some point that is kind of in a similar vein of fitting that sci-fi in with that reality is the Interdependence trilogy. Another one that we'll be getting to by John Scalzi. That's a great read. Very much not an upbeat, fun, happy-go-lucky kind of story.
Not at all.
John Scalzi is a deeply horny man.
He really is, which we'll be touching on when we get to that further along in this series.
And that, again, will be with the Kaiju Preservation Society.
Yes.
Not too much sexual stuff in that, but great read. A lot of fun. So my, if I'm going to review The Martian,
yes,
I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
I was thinking about the same thing for both the book and the movie.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. And I don't think I'll be saying that very many times.
No, solid 8 out of 10 for both, and the adaptation is 10 out of 10.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. As an adapted work, it is 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
I can't think of another single piece of work adapted quite as faithfully, with the possible exception of T.H. White's Sword in the Stone, adapted into the classic Disney movie we all grew up with. It's almost shot for shot.
I did really not know that was that accurate.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Fascinating.
So that's about all we have time for today for The Martian. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed the book. If you have not read the book and only seen the movie, I cannot recommend enough that you read it anyway. The movie does not spoil the book, it enhances it. Same vice versa.
Agreed.
And the audiobooks are also worth a read because they all contain extra stuff too. Kind of like World War Z that way.
Yes, which maybe we'll get into down the road.
Oh, that would be a fun one.
Wouldn't that be an interesting one?
Maybe next spooky season.
Oh, yeah, maybe next Halloween.
We could do that for Halloween.
I'd be down for that,
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming, guys. Thanks for hanging out with us this long. If you liked the video, if you like the ideas we have coming down the road, like, share, and subscribe to our video. We are growing fast, and every interaction is helping us with that momentum. We have so much content planned, and it's a blast bringing it all to you. And every bit of interaction is helping us grow and bring that to you. So without any more to say, I am David.
I am Ethan.
We're the Risen Empire. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you later.